I'm what some would call an avid outdoorsman. I spend a lot of time out in the wilderness, fishing, hiking, camping, but most importantly, hunting. I love to hunt. I have ever since I was a kid, though I probably have my father to blame for that. While other children were out riding bikes or having sleepovers, I was clutching a rifle, huddling next to my father to stay warm in the frigid autumn mornings. My father and I spent almost every fall together up there on the mountain. He'd teach me about the various wildlife and the different types of plants, which ones were safe and which weren't. He taught me how to track and how to maintain firearms. I remember the first time I saw my first buck. He stood there between two rows of trees only 50 meters away from me. I leveled my rifle at him, looked him square in the eye, and I squeezed the trigger. I missed, and the deer ran off into the woods to live another day. I felt defeated that day, but my father, albeit strict, was very understanding at my shortcomings. He told me even the best hunters in the world miss. That made me feel better, at least a little. The years seemed to fly by, and I had hunt nearly every type of game in those mountains. Even though I was having fun, I never let a kill go to waste. I'd always bring back what I killed to stock my freezer for the following months. After high school, I got a job working as a camp attendant on the mountain. It wasn't anything amazing, mostly I'd just sit there and read magazines all day, occasionally having to tell a group of frat guys to keep the noise down, or reminding a scatterbrained father to keep an eye on the campfire. Like I said, it was pretty boring stuff, but I did get to be closer to nature almost non-stop, and not to mention the campgrounds closed at the start of the fall hunting season, and reopened the following year. I had just packed up my truck and said goodbye to my mother. I did this every single year, and yet my mother would always tell me how much she worries. My father, on the other hand, would always tell me not to come home unless I bagged something bigger than my truck. The following morning, I woke up an hour or so before dawn, got in my truck, and drove to the mountain. I had my own personal spot I'd park my truck at, which was a narrow path which ended about halfway up the mountain. I hopped out, grabbed my gear, my rifle, and took a deep breath before walking into the woods. Around 20 minutes of walking, the sun had just started to creep over the horizon, its rays igniting the sky above me. That was always one of my favorite parts about being outdoors so early. I continued my hike through the hilly terrain, over logs and through dense brush. It wasn't long after that I arrived at a clearing. I figured this was as good a place as any to set up camp for the night. Whenever I hunt, I usually stay out for a few days at a time, just to give me more opportunities. I had quickly set up a small one-man tent, and created a small fire pit. The sun was almost directly overhead at this point. While I was still busy situating my surroundings, I couldn't help but feel eyes on me. I backed out of my tent, my rifle in hand, and scanned the tree line around me. Another good lesson from my youth was always trust your instincts. I thought perhaps a bear was getting too curious for its own good. I grinned at the thought of my dad's face if I managed to actually bring back something as large as my truck, but quickly reminded myself how dangerous these animals could be. I stood there, motionless, listening and scanning everything around me. After 5 minutes of nothing, I returned to my tent, albeit more alert than before. Finally satisfied with how my camp looked, I quickly scarfed down 3 protein bars and a bottle of water before venturing into the woods. It wasn't long before I caught the trail of a small herd of deer not too far ahead of me. I meticulously took note of each broken twig, grazing spot, and pile of droppings along the way. Just as I was about to peek my head through some underbrush, a deer jumped out at me. This caused me to jump and fall on my back hard, Before I knew it, 2 more followed it as they all scampered past me, disappearing into the woods before I could even ready my rifle. Rising to my feet, I couldn't help but notice the odd behavior. Normally, deer don't run towards a hunter like that. They usually run in the opposite direction. Unless something else had spooked them first. I peeked my head back through the underbrush and noticed something odd. There was a deer lying on the ground in a pool of its own blood. Its entire throat and chest seemed to have been torn from its body. I could feel a mix of curiosity and concern rise in my mind. I wondered what could have possibly done this, and I also wondered how I hadn't heard it happening with how close it was. While I was lost in thought, I heard the rustling of twigs and leaves on the far end of the deer. I looked up and caught a glimpse of something. Only for a moment, but whatever it was, it looked gray. A wolf, perhaps? Though it still doesn't explain why I hadn't heard it, nor why it didn't stick around to eat its prey. I decided it was probably best to start making my way back to camp. The sun was now on its descent, and I didn't want to be out in the woods after dark. It's very easy to lose your bearings at night. The twilight was growing in the sky with each passing moment. I tried to quicken my pace, but I knew I wasn't going to make it back to the camp before the sun had fully set. Still, I marched on, trying my best not to think about the possibility of wolves lurking about. I began to get that feeling again, of eyes on me from some unknown location. I felt myself instinctively grip my rifle tighter as I walked. Then, a rustling of leaves and crackling of twigs caused me to stop and aim my rifle. It was 2 squirrels chasing each other around a tree. With a heavy sigh of relief, I lowered my guard and turned back, but when I did, I saw something that froze me. There was something attached to a tree directly in front of me. It looked like a man, but not really. Its body was a grayish-blue color, and it gripped onto the tree with large claw-like fingers. I felt sweat run down the side of my face despite the cold temperature outside. Its head was erratically twitching about, as if it were looking for something. Slowly, I raised my rifle towards it, but doing this caused the creature to stop twitching its head and look directly at me. Its eyes seemed to reflect light from some unknown source. They shimmered lightly in the dusk. I wasn't sure what I was actually looking at, but my instinct told me that it wasn't friendly. I steadied my breath, lined up the shot, and fired. The gunshot echoed through the forest as birds and other creatures scurried away from the sound. The bullet hit the creature, and when it did, a new sound replaced the gunshot. The creature shrieked, loudly. I chambered another round, not wanting to take a chance. Yet, when I did, the creature was gone. I scanned the trees and the nearby ground, but there was no sign of it. I knew I had hit it, but I wasn't about to stick around to make sure. I continued my journey back to camp, but when I got there, I found my entire campsite completely ransacked. My tent was utterly shredded, and all of my supplies had been scattered about. Just then, I heard something behind me. I slowly turned, and was only a few feet away from the creature I had just shot. It was on all fours, crawling, still twitching its head as it moved. I could see it much more clearly now, even with the light missing from the sky. The skin on its mouth looked torn, and its jaw hung loosely as it breathed silently. Its eyes were completely white, almost as if it were blind. I shifted my body slightly to face the creature, and when I did, it stopped crawling. Its milky eyes were looking directly into mine at this point. In a split second, I pulled my rifle up and fired, but that did little to stop it. It leapt through the air and knocked me down. Its large claw-like fingers were scraping at me, while its mouth filled with razor-sharp teeth snapped in my face. I tried my hardest to keep it from biting me by holding it back with the body of my rifle, but this thing was immensely strong. I rocked from one side to another, and used the momentum to throw the creature off of me. It scrambled to its feet, but I was faster. I took a quick breath and squeezed the trigger, catching the creature in the head. It reeled and fell back. I got up and began running towards my truck. I looked back only once, and when I did, I saw no sign of the creature I had just shot. Panic set in as I jumped over logs and tore my clothing on branches. I was just praying that I was going the correct way. The entire time I spent running, I started to feel more and more eyes on me, as if the entire mountain was now aware of my presence. I skirted around a small hill and almost screamed happily when I saw my truck. I got into it, started it up, and drove out of there. When I made it home, my mother was happy, and my father was concerned at my wounds. I told them that a bear had attacked me, and that I had narrowly made it back. I couldn't bring myself to tell them what I really saw up there. Weeks passed by and I couldn't shake what I had experienced. I doubt I ever will. I have since quit my job at the campgrounds and have started looking for work closer to town. I have hunted everything up on that mountain, but that night was the first time something had hunted me. I don't think I will ever return to that mountain. And if you plan on going into the wilderness, be careful. Bears and wolves aren't the only things lurking within those trees.